this man walked past my table and I was kind of furiously taking notes. And he said, oh, when that book is published, I want a signed copy. And I looked at him and I just said, oh, I'm just writing in my journal. And he was like, no, you're writing a book about Jeffrey Epstein. And I was like, okay, who are you?
Welcome back to The Tea with me, Myriam François. Before we dive in, make sure to hit subscribe so you never miss an episode of The Tea. If you want to support the show and help shape future episodes, join our Patreon community. Think of it as the resistance. Plus, if you're in our top tier, you'll get access to ad-free episodes. The link's in our bio. It's been 6 years since disgraced financier and convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein allegedly took his life in a Manhattan jail cell. Yet every few months, a new revelation reminds us that this story is far from over. Epstein ran one of the largest sex trafficking rings in modern history, rumoured to involve political blackmail and espionage. So far, only ex-girlfriend and co-conspirator Ghislaine Maxwell has been held accountable. Maxwell is serving a 20-year sentence in a minimum security Texas prison, where leaked reports suggest she's receiving lenient treatment. President Trump has even hinted at pardoning her. Meanwhile, thousands of pages from the Epstein files remain sealed, despite 80% of Americans wanting them released. Just weeks ago, ex-Prince Andrew was stripped of his royal titles after new evidence linked him to Epstein. US Democrats are now pushing for him to testify before Congress. Meanwhile, Virginia Giuffre, a prominent Epstein victim, posthumously released her memoir, exposing years of grooming by powerful figures. Her story and recent death highlight how power protects predators and silences victims. So, what do the Epstein files actually reveal? And why do so many believe there's a cover-up? What does justice mean for those who lived this trauma and are still fighting to be heard? And how can the truth be told for survivors, society, and the rule of law when the facts remain locked behind sealed documents and powerful connections? To explore these questions, we're joined by Lucia Osborne-Crowley, award-winning British-Australian writer, lawyer, and journalist, who spent 5 years covering the Ghislaine Maxwell trial. She was one of the only 4 reporters in the courtroom every day of the trial. Her latest book, The Lasting Harm: Witnessing the Trial of Ghislaine Maxwell, offers an unflinching look at trauma, complicity, and power. Lucia, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really lovely to be here.
Really appreciate your time. Your book is harrowing. It's historic. It's urgent. There are many things I could say about it, but the most important, certainly, surely, is that you were one of the only people who were a witness in that courtroom day in, day out. What drew you to the case and made you queue up at, was it 2:00 in the morning to get your place in court?
Yeah, so I've always had an interest in these kinds of issues. For my whole journalism career, I've been reporting on sexual assault and sexual abuse. But this case in particular, I knew that I really wanted to cover as soon as Jeffrey Epstein died in prison in 2019, because I had come across Julie K. Brown's amazing, groundbreaking reporting before that. And I was following it really, really closely because I could tell that this was a story where there was so much more to be reported and so much more to say. And then, you know, learning about the fact that he essentially escaped justice in 2007 when he was first arrested. He was, of course, technically jailed, but he had day release for 12 hours a day where he went to his mansion in Palm Beach. So people have likened it to just sleeping in a crappy motel, not exactly a punishment. And so I was also, as a lawyer, I was really interested in that sweetheart plea deal because it's really alarming. And then he obviously got out of a trial for a second time in 2019 when he died. And then I thought, if anything does come of this, I have to be at this trial because it's been 30 years in the making. and it's going to be one of the most important trials, I think, of our generation, because there has been so much information covered up, hidden over these decades. And I just really knew that if there was a trial in open court, I would have to be there. And then the hunt started for Ghislaine when they decided to indict her. They couldn't find her for about a year. And so then I thought, okay, if and when they find her, that's the trial I'm going to cover. And I had no idea how difficult it would be, because I'm a court reporter in the UK, and the system's very different. In the US, you have to line up, as you said, to get in, and it was 2021, kind of the height of COVID, so they only let 4 reporters in the room. So you had to be one of the first 4 in line, and the time that you had to line up got earlier and earlier every day. And so there was one night, which actually happened to be the night before verdict day, where I actually didn't go home at all. I just came out of the court and stood in line and waited for the next morning. And all of that is to say, I really knew that this would be important. I also had a sense, which turned out to be true, that the mainstream media coverage would be inadequate, very biased. And so I wanted to be there so that I could produce a document about what we actually heard at that trial. And of course, I have my own history of this kind of institutional child abuse. And so I'm very, very interested in the idea of grooming. And I think our society is still very behind on understanding how grooming works in abuse situations. And Ghislaine Maxwell, it's really important to remember, is grooming was such a crucial part of what she did. And I believe, and many of the victims believe, and this jury decided, that this decades-long criminal sex trafficking ring involving minors could not have worked without her and the way that she groomed these children. And so that's something that I really wanted people to be talking more about.
And you mentioned mainstream media there and its coverage. And, I share concerns with how this story, and actually many others contemporaneously, are being covered. And I think one of the issues that stands out for me is the absolute gulf between the internet, where people, because perhaps the right questions aren't being asked in legacy media spaces, or certainly not enough questions to the right people, there's a lot of conspiracy going around this story. So let me first ask you straight up, the big one floating around is Jeffrey Epstein actually dead? And I ask this because you'll have seen on the internet people saying, well, hold on, when, somebody's dead and they're taken out, they're usually covered, right? We don't usually evacuate dead bodies with their faces. And if he was still alive, they weren't performing, heart massages to restart that. And there was none of the gear for that. Then there was the footage from the prison cell, which, was doctored. What do you say to people who aren't convinced that the official narrative is true around his death?
Well, as you say, I say to those people that there is very good reason to not be convinced by the official narrative around his death. And I personally do not know for sure what did happen, what didn't happen. But what I do know for sure is that there is very good reason to doubt what we've been told about it, because these discrepancies keep coming out. And, the minute missing from the footage is a really big one. And just everything, even around, when it actually happened, I remember just all the details that came out about the 2 prison guards being asleep at the same time. There's just a lot of things that make it a story that's quite hard to believe. And also it hasn't been told in the right way, because a lot of things were kept from the public for a long time. So I'm not surprised that people are doubting it. I do have some deeply, deeply off the record information about, what might have happened, which I won't ever be able to say unless and until that source decides that it can be reported. But I just think that, it is absolutely no surprise that there are so many quote unquote conspiracy theories around this, because almost everything about this death and its reporting is unusual.
And what was also unusual was the sorts of pressures that you came under as a journalist reporting on this case. So this is, at a time where, you're one of a number of journalists that are reporting on this. In fact, arguably, this was the trial of the century. Everyone wanted to be at this case. But you had some rather unusual encounters during your time writing this book and reporting. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely, yeah. And again, I didn't expect this to the degree that I experienced it going into the case. But now, kind of 5 or 6 years later, I can see that it should have been very obvious to me that these kind of that I would have these threats and this kind of intimidation, because as we know, and as I'm sure we will talk about, there are a lot of people who were involved in this criminal ring in some way, whether in actual criminal wrongdoing or enabling or aiding and abetting, who have never faced any consequences. A lot of those people have a lot of money and they have a lot to lose. And they really don't want to be found out. And they can throw a lot of money at the project of not being found out. So one example of this is that I went to Palm Beach in Florida, obviously where one of Jeffrey Epstein's houses was. And it was a really, really big part of this sex trafficking ring. And I went there to meet a woman named Carolyn, who testified against Ghislaine Maxwell at her trial. Carolyn's testimony was unbelievably powerful. I spoke to jurors after who said that it was really important to their decision to convict Ghislaine Maxwell. And I just reached out to her and asked if she would be willing to talk. And surprisingly, she'd never spoken to a journalist before. But surprisingly, she said yes, so I flew out there to see her. And the night that I landed, she got a visit on her doorstep from someone who said, "Hi, we know that there's a journalist here arriving in Palm Beach." They knew what time I was arriving. And they said, "We know you're planning to speak to her. Here's $5,000 to not do that." Carolyn, who's very, very sadly since passed away, was an incredibly fearless woman. So she said, "Get off my property and I will not take your $5,000. And it turned out that either that person or people associated with him were following me for the whole time that I was there. So there was a restaurant opposite the hotel that I was staying in where I would eat and take notes and things like that. And after a few days, this man walked past my table and I was kind of furiously taking notes. And he said, "Oh, when that book is published, I want a signed copy." And I looked at him and I just said, "Oh, I'm just writing in my journal." And he was like, "No, you're writing a book about Jeffrey Epstein." And I was like, "Okay, who are you?" And he sat down. So I was in a kind of corner table and he sat down next to me, so kind of locking me into my position. It was really, really close to me. And at first, he tried a couple of different things. At first, he said, "Oh, I know one of Jeff's pilots, so I'm sure he'd be happy to talk to you. Do you want to come meet him? He's on the airstrip right now. It's 11:30 at night." And I was just like, I wasn't born yesterday. I'm not coming with you to an airstrip at 11:30 at night. Absolutely not. And then he became very aggressive, very sexually aggressive, and very threatening. And it was very hard to get away from him. He offered me that same $5,000 that he had offered Carolyn the night before or a few days before. And eventually I had to get the restaurant staff to help me and they removed him. And then we waited for a while because they could see that his car was still parked outside, black Escalade. There was a few of them parked outside, and that he wasn't leaving. And the staff because I was just kind of saying, oh, this person's bothering me. I didn't tell the staff anything else. But then when he wasn't leaving, the staff said, what are you doing in Palm Beach? And I told them, and they said, okay, this isn't safe. We're going to take you out the back. They snuck me out the back. They told me the next day that the cars waited for me for hours. And, there was a similar car that turned up at my Airbnb the next day, and they were just kind of tailing me around the whole time I was there. And I've, had them, someone in Palm Beach hack into my phone and not take any of my money, because that's not what they're in my phone for. But luckily, everything in my phone is very, very well protected, so they didn't get access to anything. But certainly, I know a lot of journalists with these kinds of stories, so it is certainly true that there are people out there willing to hire and spend a lot of money on, fixers or private investigators to chase journalists who are trying to report this story. And to threaten them, because, as I said, so far they've remained unscathed, and they would really like it to stay that way. And they happen to be some of the richest people on earth, so they have money to spend on trying to silence me.
Now, call me naive, but this was the trial of one of the biggest sex trafficking rings in modern history. You are a reporter. You're also a survivor yourself. There are documented threats against other people for speaking out. Was there any protection offered to journalists, survivors, given these unusual circumstances?
It's a great question, and unfortunately not. And actually, this brings me to something I wanted to say in my first answer, which is that what I experienced that weekend, and the things that I've experienced are nothing compared to what the survivors experience. So I just want to make that really clear. I have been threatened and intimidated, but what I hear from my friends who are survivors, it is absolutely terrifying. One of them told me that Ghislaine said to her when she was trapped with them, she said, if you ever tell anyone about this, I will follow you for the rest of your life. And she's done that, probably not personally, because she's in a federal prison right now. But she kept that promise. So that same weekend that I was in Palm Beach, 2 survivors in 2 different countries were approached about my book. So 2 survivors, totally different continents, I won't say where, were found and approached because they knew that these survivors were talking to me for this book. And that was just, one of the things, it happens to them all the time. They get people turning up all the time, threatening them. A lot of them basically live in hiding. They really can't. They are so unsafe. And it's really so scary because, I think a lot about the word survivor, especially since losing Carolyn and losing Virginia, even those of us who do survive, the abuse itself, survival is kind of an everyday act. After that, it's a continuing act that you have to keep trying to keep yourself alive. And these survivors in particular have had to deal with so many threats and have had their lives completely altered, even the ones who are still alive, by these powerful people.
And you mentioned those who are still alive. There are quite a few mysterious deaths surrounding the Epstein case. Not least, of course, is Epstein's main accuser, Virginia Giuffre, who you just mentioned, who is alleged to have committed suicide, although I believe her family today dispute the suicide verdict, as did Caroline, who you were very close to. Thomas Bowers, a banker for Epstein, was found hanged in his California home in November 2019. Mark Middleton, an advisor to former President Bill Clinton, who had ties to Epstein, was found hanged and shot. Hanged and shot. at a ranch in Arkansas in May 2022. That was a suicide verdict.
Very hard to do that one, wouldn't it? On your own.
Steve Bing, who reportedly spoke to the FBI about Epstein, allegedly committed suicide in June 2020, falling from the 27th floor of his LA apartment. The Mirror reports that his ex-girlfriend had urged him to expose Epstein and that he told his attorneys about what he knew. We obviously can't speculate about foul play here. What I would ask you as a reporter is, do you think that we have done a good enough job as journalists investigating these cases? I ask because for me, Virginia Giuffre's death, and it's reported as a sort of sad passing of, somebody who was deeply traumatized. I mean, sure, could absolutely be the case, but she was also the main accuser in the biggest sex ring in history. Do we think maybe it was worth further investigation? Do you have questions?
Absolutely. And, to answer the broader question, I definitely think journalists, we as a collective, haven't done enough investigating into a lot of these deaths. I know there are a lot of people who would really like some more investigation done into Carolyn's death. As you say, I think, given that Virginia's family has questioned the suicide, it is, of course, our job to try and work out what happened. And, that comprehensive list that you just read out, it really proves the point that a lot of people have come to harm people who are connected to or trying to expose parts of this story. So certainly, I think this about all aspects of this story, but this is a really interesting example to talk about. There's barely any reporting about those deaths. A lot of people listening to this probably wouldn't know about some of the people you just listed. Even when they happened, they weren't widely reported, let alone investigated. But I feel we are at a tipping point because certainly for me, this is the first time in the last 6 years I feel like something has changed. I feel that people are responding differently, that people are really actually interested to know the truth now, and are not happy with the narratives that they've been told. And so I really am hopeful that, obviously our industry is having a tough time and it's hard to find money for investigative reporting, but I hope that institutions do commit that money, and I know that some are, because I do think this is the time where we all have to just keep producing enough stories about this, because I think that, there will be consequences for some of these people if we keep this up in this moment, because we're in a moment now where people are finally starting to care about this and finally starting to listen to these survivors. And it is so sad that they are doing that in Virginia's case when she's not here, to see them believe her and hear them believe her. As investigative journalists, we have to use this moment to make sure that those investigations do happen.
Another interesting point about this fact that the legacy media hasn't really dived that deeply into investigating these issues is the fact that that's left the terrain wide open to the sort of podcasters space to, unpick this with varying levels of actual scrutiny to factual information. There was one interesting quote that I wanted to run past you. So recently on the Tucker Carlson show, there was a discussion around Jeffrey Epstein. On that episode, Tucker basically said the most important part of the Epstein case is what it reveals about power. And I quote, about who really runs the world, who's making the decisions, and on whose behalf. So if we take those questions, and I think they're valid ones, what does the case tell us about who runs the world, who's making decisions, and on whose behalf?
Well, it is a great question, and I think this case tells us almost all we need to know about those things, because the people who are either have been proven to be connected to this or allegedly connected to this, they are picked from different spheres of power. So they are, billionaires at the top of the kind of capitalist structure, or they are politicians. One person who definitely has ties to Epstein is in the White House, and that's the most powerful political office, arguably, in the world. Of course, he denies any wrongdoing, but we know we've all seen the photos of them together, and we know that they did have a relationship. The people we're talking about, there's also names that come from the very top of the tech world, Silicon Valley, all of the kind of really the centers of power in our current society are all represented in this story. And that's terrifying because what that tells us is that all of those centers of power work together to protect each other. And as you said in your brilliant introduction, the powerful people protect perpetrators, power protects power. And so many people from all these different spheres of power have been doing this for decades. And so, in terms of on whose behalf, they're doing it on their own behalf. They're protecting each other because it guarantees protection for themselves. And so, they know that if they all close ranks when something like this happens to, at the moment it's Donald Trump and Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, and, if they close ranks around them, then they know that if it's their name that comes up, people will defend them. And so, this is one of the really, really scary things about this. Even the banks, which I haven't mentioned, all of the stories about JP Morgan, people involved in that, it proves to us that these people are going to protect each other. And it has always been that way. But what we really need to come to terms with is that, as you said, this is probably the largest sex trafficking ring in modern history. And we really need to come to terms with the fact that that went totally unpunished for 30 years. And now there has been one conviction of one person who will probably not serve that full 20 years based on, what we know about the federal justice system in the US, and is looking for a presidential pardon. So she could be out of jail any day now, and that is terrifying for survivors. So one person has faced justice. That person, in my opinion and in the opinion of the survivors that I know, certainly hasn't faced justice in a substantive way. So that should force us to really examine and really, be scared of and try and confront just how powerful people operate in our society and how hard it is to hold them accountable because of the way that they protect each other.
And on that note, I have to let you know that President Trump and Andrew Mountbatten, as well as former President Clinton, all deny any allegations of involvement in Epstein's sex trafficking ring. We're talking about power here. And one of the things that this case has really sort of confronted me with is this question of the why. Why were all these powerful men sexually abusing children? Do you feel like you understand that?
It's a really tough question. It's one that I get asked a lot. And on the one hand, especially as someone who went through this myself as a child, it's very hard to kind of imagine why an adult would do that. What would possess an adult to hurt a child in that way? I find that really, really hard to comprehend.
Demonic.
Yeah. And when you look at it at this scale, it becomes even harder to comprehend. And I think part of the why goes back to this idea of power, which is that, for whatever reason, at least some of these people were actually interested in sexually abusing children. Obviously, as you said, the people who have been named, apart from Ghislaine and Jeffrey, deny the allegations. Ghislaine and Jeffrey also deny them, but Ghislaine has been convicted, and Jeffrey is now dead. But allegedly, a number of people were interested in sexually abusing children, and that I can't explain. But there were also many, many more people who were around, who knew what was going on, or at least I find it very hard to believe, didn't know what was going on, certainly from the stories that survivors have told me about the people they saw around and what was happening in that situation. I don't think any right-thinking person could not question whether something criminal was happening. So there are a lot of people who were around, whether or not they committed any abuse, for them, I think part of the why is, again, being in that kind of inner circle of power. And Jeffrey Epstein, by all accounts, from obviously knowing people who were trapped with him for a very long time, was very, very good at manipulating people and using his power to attract other powerful people and promise them a lot of things and, make their lives better and help them live these lives of untouchable luxury. And they wanted in on that. And I think, again, that it's awful, and it speaks to, so many things about where we're at in the world, in terms of late stage capitalism and, so many structures that these people really do, they really were willing to let this happen, just because, Jeffrey Epstein was offering something to them that they wanted, which was, to be in a room with Bill Clinton, to be in a room with Donald Trump, to be in a room with Elon Musk. These are all, people that we've seen pictures of. With Epstein and with Bill Clinton, I reported a survivor saying that she actually met Bill Clinton with Jeffrey Epstein over a number of days. And so, those are facts. And those people, for them, they want power more than they care about protecting children or protecting anyone else. And it's a depraved and terrifying lack of humanity. And there were so many people who showed that that's who they were.
And how much credence do you give to the allegations that Epstein was working on behalf of a foreign government? We remember in 2019, the reporter Vicky Ward revealed that a former White House official said that Alex Acosta was told Jeffrey Epstein belonged to intelligence and to leave the matter alone. Mm-hmm. We've since heard a former Mossad operative speaking on other podcasts, basically saying, yes, he was Mossad. Do you think that this was first and foremost a pedophile ring, or was there something more, even more to this horror?
I think it's important not to downplay the fact that I think it was first and foremost a pedophile ring. But as you said, I think it is safe to have questions about whether it was more than that. As you said, there is evidence that Acosta put together that sweetheart plea deal that I mentioned because he was told that Jeffrey Epstein was an asset and that he should be protected. So there is plenty of evidence to suggest that he was working for intelligence, and so that should just mean that journalists, that we should be asking even more questions about this, and yet still there's not enough kind of hard facts out there about what Jeffrey Epstein's role was in terms of being an intelligence asset. And I really hope that that comes to light, because, again, that's another aspect of the kind of structures of power in our society that have clearly played a role in this.
Well, I would say that for me, as somebody coming at it from the outside, there were so many questions raised. You know, the FBI had been aware of Epstein since the mid-1990s, as you mentioned earlier in our conversation. Pretty much all the survivors talk about the fact that there were these lenses peeking into his Palm Beach residence that everyone was aware of. And then, of course, you know, although Acosta has since retracted this admission that he'd said that, you know, Epstein was part of intelligence, that was something that was reported back in 2019. And then I was referring earlier to Ari Ben-Menashe, who's a former Israeli intelligence officer who'd become known for his claims regarding Epstein. And he'd said that Epstein wasn't just a wealthy predator. He was that. But he was also what he called an intelligent asset involved in honey trap operations, using women to gather compromising information on powerful figures for surveillance and leverage. I suppose for me as a woman, for me as a mother, for me as someone who was a little girl at a certain point, I look at this story and I think to myself, I still don't understand why the attraction was abusing children. Are we saying that all these people in power, those named and those not named yet, are just sick? Like, all of them are pedophiles?
It's such a hard question, you know, why is it this kind of child sexual abuse that is at the heart of this? And I think, you know, it's likely a couple of things. It's probably that Jeffrey Epstein himself, you know, was a pedophile, and he's the one who kind of set all of this up from what we know. And for the others who allegedly abused minors as well, whether or not they are pedophiles, I suspect there's something which again links back to power, which is about being able to do something that the world almost unanimously agrees is one of the most egregious things you can do. And these people were being offered to be able to do that with complete impunity. And that is powerful. You know, that would make them feel powerful. So, you know, whether or not they are all pedophiles, I think there is something here which perhaps Jeffrey Epstein knew, which was that, you know, to offer them the chance to do something that almost everyone would agree is completely reprehensible and get away with it, means that you're a very powerful individual. And Jeffrey Epstein, from accounts, again, from survivors I know who were trapped with him, was very good at making people feel like that. And the sad thing is, if you know, he was promising them impunity, if that was the thing that drew them to it, he was right. You know, for almost 30 years, you know, and still now, he was right, because most of these people still haven't been charged. Most of these people who allegedly abused minors still have not been charged. So that's the really terrifying thing, is that I suspect, I mean, who knows? I don't think we'll ever be able to know which of them are paedophiles and which aren't, but I suspect what the draw card was, you know, just how powerful you would have to be in a situation to get away with a crime like that, and to have someone say, you know, you won't be punished, you'll get away with this, and he was right, and that's really, really terrifying. And I really hope that we fix that very soon, and that these people are held accountable for it, because I, for one, don't want to live in a world where you can commit a crime that, again, we almost unanimously agree is one of the most serious crimes you can commit, and get away with it.
Let me ask you about some Epstein's victims whom you've come to know personally. I have been reading Virginia Giuffre's book. It's both very, very difficult to read, but also her voice comes out in the book in a way that she sounds hopeful about life again, which I think makes her death particularly puzzling. Because if you've read the book, then you know that she actually rebuilds her life, you know, has a family, has 3 children she adores, a husband she adores. She had a life. She'd rebuilt a life for herself and was on the cusp of, I think, going after some new people, I believe, before she died. What do you think is most misunderstood about these victims that you've come to know?
Oh, just almost everything. I mean, one of the things that I talk about a lot is the way that we as a society are still unbelievably attached to what we call rape myths, which are a set of beliefs around sexual abuse that are completely false, but held and strongly believed by the majority of people in this country, at least. And so, because for whatever reason, we are still so attached to these myths, and those completely false beliefs drive how the world sees these victims. And the result of that is that these victims have been re-traumatized again and again and again and again by people who whether they admit it to themselves or not, hold these false beliefs about sexual abuse and sexual assault. And so, you know, I think with some of these victims who I now know very, very well, it's so hard to read what some people would like to suggest about them. You know, the rape myths that we're talking about include things like they made up an allegation for attention, they made up an allegation for money, they did something they regret, and so they made up an allegation. You know, when you know these people, it's so hard to see how anybody would make those assumptions. And so I really wish that more people understood that, and that's why I really wanted the book to focus on the victims themselves, rather than Ghislaine or Jeffrey, because every headline I saw when I got back to my hotel room after every day of the trial had a form of one of these rape myths in it somewhere, or was informed by it. So, you know, the best example, I think, is Annie Farmer, who testified for a very long time about being abused, and about these terrible, terrible things that happened to her. And she talked about it for hours, and it was so brave, and you know, listening to it was so powerful, and it was incredibly important to the jury. But then the defense came out and said, so she said that Ghislaine had bought her a pair of cowboy boots.
I remember this. On
one of their trips. And this is important because, again, this is something I really care about, this idea of grooming. The idea of Ghislaine making this purchase was really important to prosecutors, because it's an example of one of the stages of grooming, which is gift giving or providing a child with something that they don't have. So identifying children who are vulnerable, whose needs are not being met, and then trying to meet those needs. So buying someone a very expensive pair of boots is a really important way to show the jury Ghislaine's culpability in this. And on the shopping trip, according to the evidence, which the jury accepted, it was just Ghislaine who bought them. So Annie Farmer gave these boots to the FBI. She kept them for a long time, and the defense came out and said, "Oh, but these boots are scuffed. You know, it looks like you've worn them." And she said, Yeah, I've worn them. Which firstly should be quite obvious, because they were bought because she was going on a horse riding trip and she didn't have any boots. That's the reason that, so she would have worn them then. But, you know, she also said, yes, I've worn them since then. I wanted to try and reclaim them. And, you know, anyone who has been in a situation where there's been grooming involved and gift giving involved, which I have, can understand why you would want to reclaim items like that. It made perfect sense to me listening to it. But the defense just said there is, you know, basically said through questioning, there is no way that you are telling the truth about this abuse because you wore these boots later. And no right-thinking person, no person would wear a pair of boots given to them by an abuser. If you know anything about child sexual abuse, if you know anything about grooming, you know that most children will use the gifts that they're given even long after they've understood what happened to them. There's a lot of research into that. But that didn't matter because that day, the only thing that was in the mainstream media was the fact that Annie Farmer had been found to have worn these boots as if it was a smoking gun, you know. And I counted, I think, 72 mentions of the word boots in the articles that night. And this woman had just testified about an incredibly traumatic time in her life for hours. And none of that testimony was in the papers. The papers just talked about the boots and the fact that she wore them as if this was proof that she lied. And, you know, the coverage was shocking, but I wasn't shocked by the time I read it because I walked out of the courtroom. So there were only 4 of us in the actual courtroom, but there were overflow rooms. So there were other reporters who were watching it on a screen inside the building. So I interacted with a lot of those people. And as I said, for me, listening to that makes perfect sense to me, that she would wear the boots. Another victim, again, was cross-examined about the fact that she stayed in touch with Jeffrey Epstein after she escaped from him. Again, that makes perfect sense to me. We know that happens. I know that happens. There's a lot of reasons for that. Because the whole point of grooming and child sexual abuse is that it's incredibly confusing for a child to be betrayed by someone who promised that they would protect you. So, you know, you do want to stay in touch with them. And again, so we'd hear that evidence. It would make perfect sense to me. And I'd come out and I'd just hear these male reporters in the gaggle kind of saying, she made it up. She's lying. And they said, I just can't imagine wearing the boots. If it were me, I would never wear the boots. I would never write the email to Jeffrey. And these things that are backed up by scientific studies about grooming that we know are actually evidence that it did happen rather than that it didn't happen. And yet this myth is, you know, any myth that results in believing that victims routinely lie about sexual abuse is very attractive to us as a society, as I said, because we all, not us, obviously, but the majority of people believe them. So anything that leads you to that conclusion people will readily accept. So they just accepted that wearing the boots meant that Annie Farmer was lying. And that is still shocking to me because Annie Farmer went to the FBI in 1995 and we're sitting in this courtroom in 2021. You know, there is so much evidence. Even the Epstein Compensation Fund has accepted her evidence. And yet still somehow these reporters believe this myth that if you wear something given to you by a groomer or an abuser, it means that person couldn't possibly have done anything wrong. So that's kind of the main thing that I really wish people understood about these victims is the things that you read in the paper or wherever, the things that people are trying to tell you are proof that they are lying or not credible. Those things are completely unscientific. They are not true. They are recognized as myths about rape. And so, you know, I just wish more people knew that so that when they did read things about these people trying to, you know, discredit them, that they could say, okay, this person is using a myth to discredit someone who is in fact very, very credible. And, in this case, Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted. She appealed, partly based on my juror story, to the same judge. She lost. She appealed to the Court of Appeal. She lost. She asked the Supreme Court to hear her appeal, and they said no. So it's over. It's over for her. This conviction will stand, regardless of a presidential pardon. That's a separate thing. So, going back to the idea of conspiracy theories, Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted of conspiracy. That is one of the charges. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a conspiracy fact, because it was decided by a jury and all the appeals have been exhausted. That cannot be overturned. That is a fact.
In your book, you refer to, sorry, before I get to that, so you're referring to the jury story is both yourself, you're a survivor, you talk about your experience in the book and how that informs your understanding. And I think a connection that's very apparent with the survivors of the Epstein abuse too, right? Clearly there's a trust that's established because of your own personal experiences. And one of the jurors turns out to also have had his own experience of sexual abuse. And his understanding of certain elements of the trial was also quite distinct because of that experience. And I thought that was such an interesting part of your book because, as you say, the pervasiveness of mythology around rape victims and, to what extent they are participants in their own abuse is so common, so pervasive. And what was interesting was the extent to which those of you who've lived it were like immediately, both you and this juror, just like, yeah, no, immediately no. Like it's very apparent. So highly recommend the book for many reasons, but certainly I thought that was such an important perspective for us to hear. In your book, one of the survivors describes Ghislaine's trial as a show trial or a sham. Why is that?
So there's lots of reasons for this. Firstly, the most obvious reason is it came decades too late. And, anyone who's studied law knows that justice delayed is justice denied. But perhaps even more importantly, it was a very, very narrow trial. So what we mean by that is that the charges that ended up on the indictment were quite restricted. So firstly, the timeline, there was 10 years on the indictment. She was said to be participating in this. Based on the reporting in my book, there was many, many years before that she was involved in this, that she was not charged for, that she still hasn't been charged for. I don't know why that is. That person approached the FBI, said that they had evidence that Ghislaine was active in this in the early 90s, and the FBI did not have any interest in speaking to that person, and that person's evidence did not end up being included in the trial.
And has the FBI responded to questions around why it didn't respond to that? If you're enjoying the show, why not join our Patreon community? The Tea is more than a YouTube show. It's a space to foster meaningful change together. By becoming a member, you're supporting that mission. And if you join our top tier, you'll get exclusive ad-free episodes too. So join us now, link in our bio.
No. So I make a lot of allegations against the FBI in this book because a lot of survivors have approached them with evidence that they have ignored or just decided not to listen to. So I obviously, as we do as journalists, gave them a right of reply, and I sent them all of the allegations, and they just replied pretty quickly, actually, just saying, we have no comment on any of this. So the first line of the book is the FBI declined to comment on any of the allegations made against it in this book.
And in this interview, clearly, since we're referring to the allegations in the book.
Yes, exactly. So, that I was surprised by that decline to comment, to be honest. This is why people felt that it was kind of a show trial, because the indictment was quite narrow, because we only heard from 4 victim survivors, and we know that there are hundreds, if not thousands, out there. I've asked the FBI why that so few people testified, and I haven't been given an answer. I know people who asked to testify and were not allowed to testify. There's no good explanation for that. So what it seemed to us as journalists covering it was, it seemed like they wanted to keep it narrow enough to ensure a conviction because they really, the government really messed up in terms of letting Jeffrey Epstein get out of his own trial. And they probably felt like they really needed a conviction here. So they tried to keep it really short. It was only a 5-week trial, which is not very long. Yeah. There's so much evidence that I have in my possession that the FBI has that they did not present to that jury, and I don't know why. So there's so much more that jury, and therefore the public, could have seen about Ghislaine Maxwell that was not presented at trial. And that's why a lot of the survivors, particularly those who asked to testify and were not allowed to testify, that's why they believe that it was a show trial and that the FBI and the government wanted to kind of close the book on Epstein by saying, look, we've convicted someone. That's their belief. And we were every day shocked by, how little evidence the prosecution presented. And again, I have never been given a good answer for that by the FBI. And this is the same institution that has known about this abuse since 1995 and did nothing about it. So, and continued to do nothing about it every year, every day between then and essentially 2019. So there is obviously some reluctance in the FBI to properly investigate this. I can't say why. They won't tell me why. But it's certainly there, and just the fact that they've known about this since 1995. I mean, some victims filed a lawsuit against the FBI for this. So you can't actually sue a federal government agency in the US, but there's a really interesting piece of legislation that allows you to get around that, where if you can prove gross negligence on the part of a government agency, you can sue them. So a few of the survivors I know and their lawyers decided to do exactly that. So they filed this lawsuit against the FBI. And it says essentially the FBI should compensate every single victim who was harmed after 1995, because that's when they knew about it. And that's when it was their job to stop him and anyone connected to him from hurting children. And they didn't do that.
And what about the fact that, again, the biggest sex trafficking ring in modern history, and the only person that goes down for it is a woman. And on top of that, we saw her defense pushing the idea that she herself, in many ways, was a victim of Epstein's. Can you tell me a little bit about, based on your research and investigations, whether that stands up? Can she both be victim and perpetrator in this sense?
It is certainly true that a person can be both a victim and a perpetrator. That has absolutely no bearing on someone's criminal liability for what they do as an adult. I was a victim of this as a child, and I have never perpetrated it as an adult. The vast majority of victims have never perpetrated this same crime as an adult. So regardless of whether her allegations about being a victim of Epstein and or her father are true, that it doesn't change anything about what she did. And that's really, really, really important because there's lots of us out here who lived through that and have not inflicted it on other people. And this is what the prosecutors said in their closing, and it was incredibly powerful, that, regardless of anything else about her life, these were decisions that she made as an adult again and again and again. And she is responsible. She is criminally responsible for what she did. And again, as I said before, and as the jury accepted, her grooming was so crucial to this that, the prosecution argued that it couldn't have happened without her. Jeffrey Epstein couldn't have walked into a middle school and started talking to a middle schooler and ask them to come over and do massages. That would not have worked. Ghislaine's role in this was absolutely critical. And that's what all the victims that I know feel that way. And that's why it's really important not to let this conversation about whether or not she was a victim overshadow the fact that she is a perpetrator, that she did this. Again, she's been convicted of doing this. She's lost all of her appeals. So she's responsible for what she did. Her defense was that they were all lying, that it did not happen, and that she was being prosecuted purely as a scapegoat for Jeffrey Epstein. So essentially her defense was, Jeffrey Epstein did this. He was a terrible person. I didn't know he was doing it.
And can we just, for people who aren't super familiar with the details of this case, because I've obviously learned a lot of this reading your book and Virginia's book. So how involved was Ghislaine?
Very involved. So the jury, again, accepted evidence that she was crucial to this scheme because she was kind of the primary groomer, in the sense that it was her job to, in many cases, to find the victims. So when we talk about grooming, there are stages: identifying a victim and then isolating the victim, and then finding the needs that aren't being met. That was what Ghislaine was responsible for. And that, as I just said, the prosecution said and the jury accepted that the scheme wouldn't have worked without her. So she was deeply involved, according to her conviction. And also we heard evidence at the trial that she also committed abuse herself. So she was central. Her role really can't be overstated. I think it's really important right now. We're in a kind of political upside-down world where she's kind of trying to be exonerated in the public eye, as in a lot of people, obviously driven by Trump, who has a very good reason to want her to be exonerated, as long as she says that he didn't do anything. But a lot of people are going along with it. I'm seeing more and more about the fact that, she didn't deserve her sentence and that she wasn't that involved. And that is so, so traumatizing for victims to hear, because for them, and for the ones that I know, her betrayal is the strongest. It's one of the most important parts of their trauma, because again, as a vulnerable child who isn't being given what they need, when someone comes along and says, I'm going to save you and I'm going to look after you, and you believe them, and then they end up hurting you and betraying you, that's really at the core of trauma.
And in her case, she also, obviously is involved in the sexual assaults that happen directly, right? She's not just, for people who haven't yet read the books, she's directly involved. So the grooming, but she's also involved in the acts themselves in many cases. And I think, to your point, this idea that anyone could walk in and speak to these young girls. I think about it for myself. A man comes up to me and says, do you mind coming over here? I want to talk to you about your career. Sod off. A man and a woman, I'm suddenly thinking, okay, probably this is legit, right? Like, she wouldn't do this to another. Like, we have this thing, don't we, as women with other women, that she's not going to do that to me.
Absolutely. And, we are seen as maternal and trustworthy and things like that. And again, this is why I think it's so important that people understand that she played this role, because that part of it, that going up to a middle schooler and sitting them down and saying, what do you want to be when you grow up? What do you dream about? And finding out what they dream about and saying, I know some people who could help make that happen. Asking them about boyfriends, asking them about school, helping them with homework. These are the things that she did to earn the trust of these children that Jeffrey Epstein would never have been able to do, partly because of access, as we said, and partly because of, again, I didn't meet him, but from reports of people I know who unfortunately spent a lot of time around him, he didn't have the skills to do that. He would not have been able to play that role. And that is what is really crucial, is the fact that if he had come up to a child and said, "I'm going to make you a star," it would immediately have been more suspicious than 31-year-old Ghislaine Maxwell doing it for him. And, there's evidence that I report in my book that I'm still trying to follow up on and that the FBI knows about and has not followed up on, that there was a woman who played Ghislaine's role before Ghislaine. So before Ghislaine was in the picture, there was another woman who was doing this for Jeffrey Epstein. So that just shows us that he knew that he couldn't do this without someone, without a woman playing this role. And so that's why the trauma and the betrayal for the survivors is so severe, because she knew that's what she was being used for. She knew that's what her role was. And they believed her. And that is so hard, especially when they came from circumstances where other adults had betrayed them and other adults had not kept promises to them and had put them in harm's way. And she came along and said, "I'm going to be the one who is going to keep you safe, and I'm going to make your dreams come true." And they believed her. And Jeffrey knew that he needed someone to be able to do that.
Do you think today, Epstein's dead, Ghislaine's in prison, is the global sex trafficking ring dead? No, I don't think so. I mean, that answer is purely speculative. I haven't yet done any reporting about that, but I would be surprised if it were completely, if this wasn't happening in some form, given what we know, and certainly what I know from years of investigating, is that this went on for so many years and it became more and more sophisticated over those decades. So I'd be very surprised if that hasn't continued in some form, especially given how sophisticated we know it was, at least, by 2004, which is when the trial window ended. It's hard to imagine that all of that work to, make this sophisticated sex trafficking ring would have just been dismantled. Is there any evidence that the FBI has been actively involved in dismantling this ring? I mean, obviously we know that there were many, many more people beyond Ghislaine and Epstein involved. It's so high profile. There are so many victims. I'm thinking if I'm at the FBI, this is like top of my investigations list. Is it?
Well, from what I can tell, no, because if it was, then we would have seen more investigations and probably more indictments. And this goes back to what we saw in the summer when they announced that there was no client list and that there was I think the quote was, "not enough evidence to indict uncharged third parties." And that is very difficult to pass because the evidence that's in the public domain is enough to begin an investigation into certain individuals. So there are lawsuits that are publicly available where people other than Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein are accused of sexually abusing these victims. That should be enough. A legal document where a lawyer has signed a statement of truth to say, we believe that everything in this is true, that should be enough for the FBI. So for them to say, "oh, this secret information that we have, we're telling you that it's not enough to charge anybody," when what's in the public domain is already enough. And so they should be doing that. They should be looking at these people. So, for example, there's a lawsuit that was filed, as I mentioned, against the FBI, and that included a list of witnesses. And those witnesses were people where the lawyers have to say, this person knew or ought to have known something about this criminal act. And a lawyer, again, has to sign that statement. It's a strict profession, and they've signed a statement saying, I believe or know that these people knew or ought to have known something. And the people on that list could be questioned and investigated by the FBI just based on that. And they have not. So it can't be a priority for the FBI. And I think, the term cover-up, we've talked about conspiracy theories. It's so often used in this way that kind of makes it seem like we're talking about some huge, big cover-up. But when we talk about, we do this a lot as lawyers, when we talk about what that actually means, we do know that there have been some cover-ups here in the sense that we know that the FBI has information about people that they've chosen not to act on. That is a fact. And so, that is not the kind of large-scale cover-up that people on the internet talk about, but it is some kind of cover-up that the FBI has,
And it's a fact based on evidence you've seen yourself?
Yes, and also, as I said, evidence that's in the public domain, evidence that's been filed in lawsuits that they could use to begin an investigation. Whether it's enough to indict someone, that's a different story, but certainly to bring someone in for questioning, and even that hasn't happened. And in fact, the courts said this when Trump's Department of Justice asked to unseal the grand jury transcripts. So grand jury transcripts are sealed in perpetuity. That's always been a rule. It's very, very, very difficult to unseal them. Trump's lawyers would have known this. Their arguments didn't fall into any of the categories where they would be unsealed, but they wanted the public to think that they were working towards transparency. So what they did was they went to the courts and said, please, can you unseal these grand jury transcripts? And I thought immediately, this is ridiculous because they know that it won't work. They're just doing it because, they want to look like they're doing something about it. But luckily, you don't have to take my word for it because the federal judge said exactly that. The federal judge said there is nothing in these files that the FBI does not already have and could release itself. So, that's coming from a judge essentially slapping them on the wrist and saying, don't come to me and pretend that me unsealing these transcripts is going to change anything when you have all the information you need. And if you wanted to release it to the public tomorrow, you could.
One of the things that's come up a lot in this reporting on this case has been that, Epstein allegedly harmed, over 1,000 victims. Of those, 225 had made claims. But of those who did, approximately 150 survivors were paid off from the Epstein estate through the Epstein Victim Compensation Program, with over $121 million distributed. 92% of those who received offers accepted them, and a few victims opted to pursue lawsuits instead. I'm sure you are very familiar with this question. Why would a victim opt for the financial compensation which, as I understand it, muzzles your ability to speak publicly about what happened to you versus pursuing the lawsuit?
So again, this would really come down to each survivor's situation, what their needs are and what's important to them. So as you say, the Epstein Compensation Fund had a kind of boilerplate agreement attached to it. And if you pursued a lawsuit individually, you would be able to fight for a more tailored settlement agreement if a settlement was what you wanted. So if people did want something that was more tailored to them, it would make more sense for them to proceed with a private lawsuit of their own. But it also, it depends on a lot of things. It depends on whether they could afford to pay lawyers to do their own lawsuit. And that's different, in a lot of these survivors' cases, that wouldn't be possible. Civil lawyers are very expensive.
Lawyers are.
Yeah, yes, exactly. So there's lots of different reasons that people chose different paths here. I think what's really important to say that kind of goes back to these infuriating rape myths that we were talking about is that, as you say, a lot of money was paid out of the Epstein Victims Compensation Fund. That means that those victims presented evidence, that it was very thoroughly tested. This is coming from Epstein's estate himself. So
he's not paying out for the fun of it.
No, he's not going to let anything through that isn't rock solid. So the people who were given awards from the compensation fund, that is a statement from the legal system that evidence was accepted. That's incredibly important because, as we've just said, that compensation fund would not have done that lightly. So what's wild is that, fast forward to 2021, I'm sitting in a federal courthouse in Manhattan, and these survivors who testified, who received compensation from the fund, basically the defense uses this against them, which is absolutely baffling in terms of why anyone would accept this. You know, as lawyers, we are supposed to be attached to things like reason and logic, and this defies both of those. Because what these lawyers are saying are, oh, so you got $2 million from the fund, and they would say yes. And the lawyers would then ask a series of questions that basically are accusing them of making up a story for money.
Right.
And that, again, is one of these key rape myths. But it makes no sense because what that rape myth is, and what the defense lawyers were suggesting, was that they were making false allegations to get money, right? Yeah. That's the idea. And again, a lot of the male reporters came out and they were like, she did it for the money, you know, she made it up for the money. So, but there's a crucial difference here, because the defense position was, you've made up a false allegation for money. What happened was that the EPSTEIN Compensation Fund paid them for what they determined was a truthful allegation.
So it was literally the opposite.
Literally, it was evidence that was accepted that this happened. And it was used against them. It was used to undermine their credibility. And the fact that people listening can't immediately say, hang on, if this person was paid compensation by his own estate, protected by his own lawyers, then, you know, that's a statement that their evidence was accepted as truthful. So why are these defense lawyers suggesting that it's evidence that it's not truthful? It's this kind of upside down world where something that is, is proof of their credibility is somehow used
as the opposite. I mean, I feel like we're currently living in this era of, like, you know, we're told black is white and white is black, the sky is pink or it's blue. I mean, we're just this is a recurring phenomena that I'm observing in multiple spheres of reporting. Let me ask you about these new documents that were recently revealed that JP Morgan, the largest bank in the US, warned the US government about more than $1 billion in what it regarded as suspicious transactions linked to Jeffrey Epstein after his death, that were possibly related to reports of human trafficking, according to the documents. Do you hold any hope that these kinds of revelations will lead to further accountability? There are bank transactions. I mean, after death.
Yes. And I do actually hold a lot of hope. And that's not always been true in the last 6 years of my life. I've sometimes had glimmers of hope, but not for long. But right now, things feel different. I do feel hopeful because we are seeing this leaked information that is incredibly damning and that really, really needs to be investigated. And as you rightly point out, this is after his death, which means it was after he was re-indicted. So this is after he was indicted for the, you know, more serious crimes that he actually committed rather than what he pled to in 2007, 2008. So someone who is under indictment for some of the most serious crimes on the statute books, if if there are suspicious transactions relating to a person who has been indicted for those crimes, of course a bank should be actioning that. And, there are very tough regulations, anti-money laundering regulations that require banks to flag this kind of suspicious activity. So this is a really good example of evidence that tells me that we are at a tipping point, because this leaked information, people have this information and they are finally starting to bring it to journalists, and that this kind of thing can't be ignored because, as you say, there are transactions, we have dates, we have metadata. So the fact that these things are coming out of the woodwork is what makes me feel hopeful, because, from what we heard at trial and from what I know and from what I've reported, there is so much evidence out there that someone has access to. And we just need those people to come forward. And it seems like they finally are, because we also have, the emails from former Prince Andrew, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, that those emails were really important because he told Emily Maitlis a few important things in 2019. He said that he'd cut off his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein in 2010. He said categorically he did not remember meeting Virginia, and he suggested that the photo with her was doctored. We now have emails where he says, I may have met her and there may be a photo. So he wrote that email in 2011, and he went on TV in 2019 and lied. If it's true what he said in the email, that he believed that he may have met her and that there may be a photo, and then he went on to tell the British public and the world that he did not remember meeting her, that's really, really important, because that goes to his credibility. And so the thing here is that those emails have existed this whole time. Someone has had them. What is different now is that they are being released one way or the other, either being leaked or, what Congress is doing is really helping as well. So that's what makes me hopeful, because there is hard evidence that we haven't seen. There are more emails and bank transactions and things like that. And what's different right now is that we're seeing those things. And that I think will make a big difference.
And is it significant that a member of the royal household is being investigated by the Met Police?
Hugely significant. It's unprecedented. It's really, even I was surprised by that. The Met is a historically extremely conservative institution, and they certainly don't have a great record in terms of prosecuting these kinds of crimes. The UK is one of the worst in terms of arrests and charge in terms of sexual abuse and sexual assault. So I wasn't expecting them to investigate this, and that is hugely significant, because if they do bring charges, and the latest I've heard is that that is still a live option, that they still might do that. The fact that they've even announced that they're looking into it is hugely significant. If they do bring charges, it sounds like, from what we know, the charge would be aiding and abetting misuse of public funds. So that's because the emails suggest that he asked his bodyguard to investigate Virginia. His bodyguard is at least partly taxpayer funded, and is a member of the police. So that's using taxpayer money to do something illegal.
Isn't his whole life taxpayer money?
Basically, yes.
I want a refund.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. And yeah, taxpayers in this country have spent so much money on this man. And this is just one example of that. And the fact that what the Met said was that they were thinking of the charge aiding and abetting misuse of public funds, that implies that the charge is against him personally. Because before, when they said we're investigating, there's a world in which maybe they would have charged the bodyguard for if they actioned this. But the way they phrased the charge implies, I don't know,
Yeah.
implies that they're thinking about actually charging him. And that would be remarkable and a huge, huge step forward because it represents accountability. And it means that he will have to be questioned and perhaps face trial. And also, as we've already seen, it's emboldened the US to demand testimony from him.
He may speak.
He
Maybe.
He may.
Maybe, depending on what's hung over him if he doesn't, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let me ask you about something that I know a lot of viewers will be watching this and they'll be like, we want names, you know? And I'm sure you get this all the time, Lucia. Virginia Giuffre described different types of men who abused her in her book, but she says billionaire 1, billionaire 2, a well-known former prime minister, which I think in the UK version is changed to a well-known minister. Mm-hmm. Amy Wallace, the ghostwriter of her memoir, mentioned she knows who exactly these people are, but the FBI also knows who these people are. So why can't we name them?
This infuriates me so much, and there's two reasons. I mean, there are a few names that I wanted to include in my book that I wasn't allowed to. I suspect at least two of those names, some of the ones that Virginia mentioned. Obviously, I don't know, but I suspect that there is an overlap there. And, she wasn't allowed to publish the names either. And so the answer is, we are living in a time where the courts, particularly in the UK, but all over the world, are incredibly hostile to public interest journalism. So our defamation laws are just absolutely not fit for purpose when it comes to just the idea of public interest journalism, because the reason that publishers are too scared to reveal these names is that our defamation laws allow these people to walk into an English court and file a defamation suit against myself, against my publisher, against anyone who has said these names. The thing about that is that it costs a lot of money to file a defamation lawsuit, and it costs a lot of money to defend a defamation lawsuit. So for these people, a lot of the people that certainly I was discussing when I wanted to name them, the amount of money you'd need to pay out to file a lawsuit would be totally out of the question for me, as in I would never have that in cash. But for them, it's pocket change, and so they would have the money to spend, the 10 grand filing these suits in every jurisdiction that my book is published. And that would mean very little to them. Whereas I do not have the money to defend myself, and it costs a lot more to defend a defamation suit than it does to file one. So publishers and newspapers don't have the money to defend them either. So institutions, newspapers, publishers are increasingly being silenced by the fact that if they want to take any risks in terms of defamation, they have to know that they have the liquidity to defend themselves in court. And in this media landscape, we a lot of institutions don't. And that's certainly, I think, why the names were taken out of my book. And that is one area that I feel very strongly about, that we really, really have to change. And that's at a kind of legislation level. This is, you can write to your MP, things like this, and say, we need to change these defamation laws. We need to stop silencing victims because, again, this is about power. This is about the fact that these alleged perpetrators are powerful and therefore rich, and therefore they can just file defamation lawsuits left, right, and centre against an industry of people like us, journalists, who are not rich, not paid particularly well, and certainly not paid enough to spend tens, hundreds, thousands, if not millions of dollars on a defence. So that really needs to change. A proposal I have that I think would be quite fairly easy to institute would be for there to be some sort of merit testing for a defamation case before it is formally filed. So a judge to be able to look at something and say, is there merit in this, or is this a perpetrator trying to silence a victim? and doing so because they can afford to. That is a thing that judges could do and could throw out a defamation case at an early stage before either the victim or the reporter who has reported the victim's allegations has to defend themselves. So, that's something that is being considered. It's called anti-slap legislation. I really, really think we need to push that. But I also think that if we are at this kind of tipping point that I'm suggesting we are at a certain point, it won't matter so much, because if we keep reporting these stories, if this stays in the news, that will mean that these people who do have these documents, these emails, photos, maybe footage, who knows, they will come forward. Those things will be reported. And it will get to a point where those people, whoever they are, those unnamed people, if there's more reports about them, more evidence, they will face public consequences. So Andrew is a perfect example of this. Andrew, because of the new evidence that has been produced and leaked because of the point that we're at, he's faced very public consequences. And those public consequences mean he would have a very hard time telling a court that he needed to protect his reputation, which is what a defamation case is about. So that changes the perpetrator's or alleged perpetrator's ability to file a defamation suit, because if you've already faced public consequences, not necessarily criminal or legal consequences, but if you've faced public consequences like Andrew has, it's much harder to go to a court and say, I have a reputation to uphold, because that reputation has already been publicly questioned. So if we keep doing that, what's happened with Andrew is a really good example of how we can move forward in terms of naming these names without changing the defamation laws. Because if we keep doing it and then we push for more and more kind of stories and investigations, and that leads to these public consequences outside the justice system, those public consequences make it harder for these alleged perpetrators to use the justice system to silence victims and reporters.
Now, I know that you know certain names that you can't say on this program. Very sadly, we wish we could share some of this with you. I know Lucia wishes she could share this information with you too. Presumably, some of these people are titans in the world. They are very powerful people. The revelations about them would take down, corporations, maybe governments. You're hopeful that there is a shift happening right now. Do you think that those big names, those that you know, will come to see accountability?
Yes. For a select group of them, I actually, for the first time, I do think they will. I don't know what that accountability would look like, or if it would be even remotely sufficient. But some of the names I have in my mind, I do think that whether it's tomorrow or 5 years from now, they will face consequences for this. I really do quite strongly believe that, because of the evidence that I know is out there, and because I can see that the landscape is changing in terms of hopefully it becoming safer for people to come forward with that evidence against those people, and for more victims to come forward. And so I really do believe, I'd say it's probably 2 or 3 people that I do believe will be held accountable. The rest of them, I'm not so sure, but any big story like this in the history of journalism is never kind of one headline that changes the world. It's always a death by 1,000 cuts. And, we're just getting to that level where there are enough cuts that I do think at least some of them. I mean, Andrew facing such severe public consequences is something that we wouldn't have imagined 6 years ago. I wouldn't have, as an investigative reporter looking into this. I honestly wouldn't have predicted that.
Of everyone that is speculated about online. I'm not sure he would have been my first, but interesting. It looks like maybe King Charles knows a thing or two that isn't public and has lost patience, perhaps.
Yes, exactly. And there are other people who will be in that situation, who will be linked to people against whom I believe there will be more evidence coming out. What's happened to Andrew proves that this is possible. And that's why I think it's really significant. I mean, the stripping of royal titles doesn't mean anything to me. I'm no fan of the monarchy or the royal family, but it means a lot to him. And, you know, and that's what's important. And it is a consequence. And again, having the police involved is unprecedented. So yes, I do think that within the next few years, we will see some of the names that I'm thinking of right now really, really face, if not justice, at least some form of accountability and at least be named publicly.
Beyond the TikTok warriors.
Exactly.
Lucia, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
If you like what we do here, hit subscribe to support our work, share this with your circle, and drop your take in the comments below. To stay in the loop with all our conversations, subscribe on YouTube and follow us on Instagram and TikTok. Links are in our bio. And have you joined us on Patreon yet? Patreon members get ad-free episodes, exclusive content, and a front role in charting our new stories. Remember, fearless, independent journalism doesn't come free. Your support keeps us honest, uncensored, and fearless. Until next time, stay awake, keep questioning, and support the fight back. Thanks for tuning into The Tea. If this episode resonated with you, drop a comment and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And why not dive into these other episodes we think you'll love? Let's keep the conversation going.